I never thought I'd see her there. Not in this hall, all floral arrangements and clinking glasses, not in a place meant for celebration. Yet there she was, taller than I remembered, heels that made her posture sharper, hair pulled back just enough to reveal that precise angle of her neck I used to catch in passing, never daring to stare. I told myself I shouldn't linger, shouldn't even care, but the moment I spotted her, the world seemed to shrink, as if the air itself had pulled tight around her. I stood near the edge of the crowd, my hands awkwardly tucked in my jacket pockets, trying to convince myself I was here for anyone but her. We'd met months ago, in a way that should have felt mundane but didn't. She had walked into my little repair shop, not that it was much, just a dusty corner of the city where I fixed cars and sometimes people's tempers, and asked if I could look at her old sedan. She didn't need much from me, just a fix and a receipt, but there was a precision in the way she spoke, a calm command underlaid with something brittle, like porcelain edges. I had noticed the faint tremor in her hands when she handed me the keys, the way she avoided my eyes for the briefest second, and it made me want to reach for her attention, though I knew better. That day, I remember her watching me as I worked under the hood, quiet but sharp, and how she said, "Take your time. It's okay if it's slow," and the world shrank again. The okay lingered, but it was heavy with unspoken meaning. She had this way of saying ordinary things that sounded like confessions. Back at the wedding, I caught her glance across the room. It lasted a fraction longer than politeness, a beat too long to be accidental. My stomach knotted, the old, familiar ache of wanting to speak, but knowing every word could be wrong. And then she smiled, a subtle lift of the lips, almost imperceptible, like a secret only she knew she was sharing. I noticed details I hadn't before. The way she tilted her head ever so slightly when she laughed at someone else's joke. The way her hand brushed against the edge of her glass, lingering, as if she were weighing the world in that small motion. Something about her presence demanded attention, not in a loud way, but in a pull I couldn't resist. I stayed where I was, pretending to adjust my tie, though I wasn't wearing one properly. My mind raced with small, ridiculous scenarios. Should I walk over? Should I wait for her to speak? Could I even say hello without sounding like a fool? Then she shifted, her eyes scanning the room, and for a second, just a heartbeat, our gazes met again. No words, no awkward introductions, just that suspended silence that said more than polite conversation ever could. The band started playing something slow in the background, but I barely noticed. All I could feel was the weight of that glance, the pull of familiarity and the dangerous tug of something I wasn't supposed to feel, not here, not now. And yet, I couldn't stop thinking about it, the way her eyes held mine a moment too long, the way a single smile could make an ordinary wedding hall feel like the smallest, most intimate place in the world. I leaned back against the wall, pretending to sip from a glass I hadn't touched, and thought, why does she make it feel like she's always just a step away from letting me in? And maybe she never will. I saw her again a week later, not at some grand event this time, but in a quiet corner of the hotel where she was arranging last-minute details for her sister's engagement party. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and strong coffee, and the low hum of conversation barely reached the small nook where I helped her carry boxes of decorations. She didn't look up at first, her focus entirely on balancing fragile crystal candle holders, as if the slightest misstep might shatter everything. I followed her silently, careful not to jostle the stack, noticing how her shoulders stiffened with a habitual tension. She moved deliberately, precise, like someone who had learned to hide the cracks beneath a polished surface. "Are you sure this goes here?" I asked, lifting one of the lighter boxes. My voice startled her just slightly, and for the briefest instant, she froze, hand midair, lips pressed together, as though deciding whether to trust me with her attention. "Yes," she said softly, almost dismissively, though her tone betrayed a flicker of doubt. Her eyes avoided mine as she bent down to adjust a chair. I noticed the faint line beneath them, a subtle shadow that spoke of too many late nights and not enough rest. Her hair fell loose from the bun she had attempted, a few strands brushing her cheek in a way that seemed accidental but impossible to ignore. I wanted to say something, anything, that might ease the weight she carried, but I didn't. Instead, I carried the box in silence, following her lead, watching how her fingers grazed the edge of the table, the way she breathed through the small tension in her chest. There was a kind of vulnerability in her movements, quiet, almost invisible if you weren't paying attention. She finally paused, leaning against the table for a second too long, a hand pressed lightly to her forehead. Her shoulders slumped in a way that made me want to reach out, to offer some wordless comfort. But I stayed still, pretending to sort through some napkins, though my eyes didn't leave her. "You always notice everything, don't you?" she murmured, half to herself, half to me. I blinked, unsure if it was meant as a challenge or an acknowledgement. Her eyes flicked up, meeting mine for a moment, a flicker of something unspoken passing between us. I could see a hint of tired amusement there, like she was testing whether I would retreat or stay. "Not everything," I said quietly. "Just what matters." My words hung in the air longer than I expected. She looked away, adjusting the candles again, and I saw her bite her lip, a micro-movement that made my chest tighten without explanation. We worked side by side for the next 10 minutes, moving through the quiet room, the hum of the lobby fading to the background. And then she laughed, softly, almost reluctant, at something that wasn't funny at all, and it was like a spark flickered somewhere I hadn't realized existed. It wasn't a bold laugh, not loud or free, but it was hers, and it left a strange warmth lingering between us. She glanced at me again, this time just slightly, before focusing back on her work. And as our hands brushed over a small stack of napkins, just for a second, my stomach flipped. The moment was fleeting, almost nothing, and yet I couldn't shake it. I stepped back slightly, pretending to straighten a chair, but my mind stayed caught on that subtle movement, that laugh, the small, precise gestures that made her entirely her, and entirely unattainable. And I realized I had been holding my breath without noticing. She doesn't have to look at me, she doesn't even have to smile, but when she does, everything tilts a little. The rain had started just as we left the hotel, the kind of steady drizzle that made streetlights shimmer in puddles and blurred the edges of everything. She was holding the umbrella, though I could have taken it. I didn't. Somehow, walking close under that small arc of fabric felt like stepping into a different world, one where every misstep, every breath, carried weight. We moved slowly, side by side, not speaking. The air between us hummed in the way it always did when we were alone, charged, expectant, and unbearably fragile. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I noticed how her coat clung to her in the wet, the way the fabric fell across her shoulders, how her fingers tightened briefly on the umbrella handle. Small, almost invisible details, but they sent a current through me I couldn't quiet. "Do you need a ride?" I asked finally, careful, measured, like testing a fragile surface. She shook her head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth, but her eyes were elsewhere, distant. "No, I'll walk. Not far." Her voice was steady, but there was a hesitation that made my chest ache. The sidewalk narrowed, forcing us closer. Our shoulders brushed just enough to make me aware of every subtle movement, every heartbeat that sped without permission. I imagined saying something reckless, leaning closer, letting my hand graze hers, but I didn't. I couldn't. A sudden vibration from her phone made her flinch, breaking the moment. She glanced down, just long enough for me to see a name I knew well enough to hurt, her ex-husband. She pressed decline, murmured, "Not now," and tucked the phone back into her bag, a forced composure masking something raw beneath. The tension between us shifted, unspoken understanding passed in that tiny gesture. She didn't need to explain, and I didn't ask. We slowed at the corner, waiting for the light to change. The rain fell harder now, dripping from her hair onto her collar. I reached instinctively to brush it away, hesitated midair, and froze. She noticed, a faint raise of her brows, but said nothing. The air thickened, and I realized how close we were. Too close. And how utterly impossible it was to say what I wanted without shattering the fragile equilibrium we'd built. "I should go," I murmured, stepping back almost involuntarily, though part of me wanted to stay. Her eyes flicked up, caught mine for just a fraction longer than necessary, and in that second I imagined leaning forward, letting our foreheads brush, saying something stupid and true at once. But the light changed, and the moment vanished as quickly as it had come. She turned, walking toward her apartment, umbrella shielding her from the rain, each step deliberate, composed. I stayed on the corner, watching, feeling the pull of her presence linger long after she disappeared from view. The street seemed emptier now, colder, and I realized the storm outside had nothing on the one that had just passed between us. And yet, as I started down the other side of the street, my hand lingered where hers might have been, a faint echo of what nearly happened, a question suspended in the rain. How close is too close before everything changes? It was late. The office was empty, except for the faint hum of the air conditioner and the muted tapping of her heels as she walked to the window. Outside, the city sprawled under a half-lit sky, and the occasional car reflected off the glass like distant stars. I stayed behind my desk, pretending to check emails I didn't care about, but my eyes kept drifting to her. She didn't notice, or she chose not to. I could see it in the tight line of her shoulders, the way her fingers drummed on the windowsill, as if she were counting something invisible. Finally, she exhaled, slow, deliberate, and turned toward me. "Why are we like this?" Her voice was soft, not accusatory, but brittle, like it could crack if pressed too hard. I swallowed, unsure how to answer. Like what? I wanted to say everything and nothing at once. Instead, I just nodded, the sound barely audible. "I don't know," she admitted, almost to herself. She stepped closer, but not close enough to reach me. Her gaze lingered, and I felt the pull of something dangerous and undefined. I shouldn't feel whatever this is, and yet I do. The words hung between us. I wanted to reach out, to speak, to bridge the gap, but all I could do was watch. Her hair caught the light, a soft halo around her, and I noticed the faint tremor in her hand. It was small, maybe imperceptible, but it made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't control. I've spent so long pretending I could keep control, that I could manage everything. She continued, voice lower now, raw. "And I can't. Not with you here. Not like this." Her eyes never left mine, holding me accountable without demanding anything. I wanted to tell her that I'd felt it too, that I'd been standing on the edge of saying something reckless every time we were alone, that I'd noticed every small gesture, every pause, every glance she thought went unnoticed. But I stayed silent, because words might break the fragile balance between us, or maybe because I didn't even know which words were safe. We stood there, neither moving, letting the silence swell around us. Every second stretched impossibly long, weighted with confessions neither of us could say aloud. I saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her jaw clenched slightly as she tried to compose herself. And I realized she was fighting as hard as I was, fighting for something we couldn't name. "I don't know what I'm doing," she whispered finally, almost a sob hidden behind the quiet. "And I don't want to know. Not yet." Her words cut deeper than anything she could have said in anger. They weren't a plea or a demand. They weren't even a confession. They were a revelation, unvarnished and terrifyingly real. I nodded again, slowly, my throat tight, unable to speak. For once, the space between us wasn't charged with possibility. It was heavy with reality. And then, she stepped back, letting the silence fill the room, and said, barely above a whisper, but with every ounce of her, "Maybe we're not allowed to be the people we want to be, not yet. Maybe never." I hadn't planned on going back to her apartment that night. Really, I hadn't. But when the rain picked up again, and I saw her standing under the awning, shaking her umbrella like she was trying to wring out a thought, I found myself walking beside her without thinking. Inside, the apartment was quiet in a way that made every sound too loud. Her keys clattering against the counter, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the old floorboards. She moved around like she owned the space, but there was a tension under her movements, a tightness in the way she leaned over the counter, setting down her bag. I want to show you something," she said, hesitating, voice small, vulnerable in a way I'd never heard before. She went to a drawer and pulled out a small, worn photo, sliding it across the table without meeting my eyes. I picked it up carefully. It was a picture of her younger self, smiling with someone else, someone I didn't recognize at first, then realized was the husband she'd divorced. I studied the photo, but it wasn't the image that unsettled me. It was the weight behind it. He left before I could, she trailed off, pressing her fingers to her lips, as if trying to stop herself from spilling everything. Her eyes flicked up at me, and there was something fragile in them, something raw that I hadn't seen in all our previous encounters. I loved him, and he just went, left me with all the pieces I didn't know how to hold. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to reach across the table, to offer comfort, but I didn't. Instead, I just nodded slowly, letting the silence fill the space between us. Every detail of her, the faint curve of her wrist, the way she bit her lower lip, the shadow under her eyes, hit me harder than any words could. I didn't tell anyone, she continued, voice quieter now, almost a whisper. Not my friends, not my family. I pretended it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. Not ever. She looked away, as if the words themselves were too heavy to bear. I remembered then a conversation she had once had with me, in passing, about losing someone you never thought you'd lose. About the way memory lingers longer than life sometimes. I said nothing, but I reached for the photo gently, placing it back on the counter without touching her hand. She finally looked at me then, and for the first time, there was no deflection, no composed mask. Just her, the weight of everything she'd carried, finally visible. And I realized that the vulnerability between us, the tension, the unsaid words, the small stolen moments, wasn't just about curiosity or attraction. It was about the pieces of our lives we had both left unspoken, now brushing against each other in ways neither of us could fully name. She drew in a breath, long and slow, then whispered, almost to herself, I don't know why I'm showing you this, maybe because I'm tired of pretending no one else saw me break. I stayed silent, and for the first time, I understood the shift that had been creeping in all along, not in her actions, not in our shared glances, but in the quiet acknowledgement that maybe, finally, someone did. And in that room, with the photo between us and the rain tapping against the window, something fragile shifted, soft, seismic, unspoken. We didn't talk about it that night, about what had been simmering between us, about the storm of small moments that had led here. We just sat in her apartment, the city outside murmuring through the rain-streaked windows, and somehow that was enough. She was on the couch, knees drawn slightly, holding a mug of tea I hadn't realized she'd made. Steam curled toward the ceiling, carrying the faint scent of chamomile and something uniquely hers. I perched on the armrest, careful not to crowd her, careful not to assume anything, though I could feel the electricity in the quiet, the way a single glance could speak more than pages of words. You're quiet, she said softly, not accusatory, just noting. I'm listening, I said. My voice felt small in the space, almost inadequate, but she didn't laugh or correct me. She just nodded, eyes flicking down to the mug, tracing the rim with a fingertip. There was a pause that stretched, a silence that wasn't uncomfortable. It was full, almost heavy with meaning. I noticed the small details, the faint tremor in her hands as she sipped, the way her hair fell across her forehead, the subtle exhale she released when she realized I was watching. And in that observation, I realized something. She had always noticed me, too. Every pause, every glance, every hesitation. We had been circling each other in quiet orbit for months, and now the orbit was breaking, collapsing towards something inevitable. I never thought, she began, then stopped. Her voice cracked just slightly, and I could see the weight of unspoken words pressing against her chest. She didn't need to finish. I already understood. I reached out slowly, hesitated, and let my hand brush against hers. Not a grab, not a declaration, just a touch, a connection, a quiet acknowledgement. Her fingers didn't pull away. They didn't need to. The gesture said everything and nothing, fragile and final all at once. We stayed like that for a long moment, breathing in the shared space, the silence heavy with everything we'd left unspoken until now. I could feel her lean slightly toward me, not fully, not intentionally, just naturally, the way someone does when they stop pretending the world outside matters. The rain fell harder, drumming against the windows, but it felt like background noise to the quiet in the room. I let my forehead rest lightly against hers, careful, tentative, but the touch anchored everything. There were no words, no confessions, no promises, just acknowledgement, presence, and the gentle certainty that the distance between us had finally dissolved. Her hand squeezed mine lightly, almost imperceptibly, and I squeezed back, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The small motion carried all the weight of months of tension, of longing, of uncertainty. And somehow, in that ordinary, unremarkable gesture, everything settled. We didn't need to speak. We didn't need to define it. The room, the rain, the warmth of her hand, these were enough. For the first time, everything felt aligned, right in its imperfection, and I understood that some truths didn't need words. We just sat together, quietly, letting the world continue without interruption. And in that stillness, I realized that what had been inevitable for so long had finally arrived. And that was enough. Looking back, I think the strangest part was how quietly it happened. There were no grand confessions, no cinematic moments, nothing that would have made a scene worth filming. Just us, two people who had spent months skirting the edges of each other's lives, finally letting the small, honest things guide us. She's changed in ways I can't always put into words. Not visibly, maybe not outwardly at all. But there's a softness now in her pauses, a willingness to let someone in without fear that it will cost her everything. I see it in the way she talks now, not carefully measured, not hiding, just her. And I realize that she allowed herself to be seen, truly seen, for the first time in a long time. And me? I've changed too. I learned that noticing someone, truly noticing them, requires patience, restraint, and sometimes the courage to stay silent when you want to speak. I've learned that love doesn't always need to roar to exist. Sometimes it's in the quiet gestures, the small touches, the shared silences that stretch long enough to feel like a heartbeat. Our connection didn't explode overnight. It didn't have fireworks or declarations. It settled, slowly, in the corners of our days, the glance across a room, the brush of a hand, a shared cup of coffee in the early morning light. What I thought might have been forbidden or impossible became inevitable, but not because of fate or coincidence or dramatic timing. It became inevitable because we had chosen it, in little ways, every single time we noticed each other and stayed present. I think that's the hardest thing to understand when you're watching a story like ours unfold in your mind. Love isn't always about the big gestures. Sometimes it's about endurance, attention, patience, and the courage to be quietly human with someone else. And when those pieces align, you realize that it was never about perfection. It was about honesty. Even now, when I see her in the soft light of the apartment we've shared, or when I hear her laugh in some small, ordinary way, I remember the months we spent circling each other, the near misses, the silences, the moments we almost said too much. And I feel the weight of how fragile and yet how unshakable our bond has become. Life has a way of teaching you what matters, not through grand lessons, but in the subtle, persistent details that accumulate until you finally notice them. I learned that the heart is patient, sometimes painfully so, and that connection, when it's real, doesn't need to be rushed or forced. It finds its own pace. So now, when I think of her, I smile quietly, not out loud, not with a fanfare, but in the kind of deep, settled way that comes when you've been given a rare gift. Someone who sees you, and someone you can see completely. And that, I think, is enough. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?